The ballroom held 400 of the most decorated military medical minds in the country, and every single one of them laughed at her. Captain Dominic Varro stood at the podium with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong, pointing at Claire Whitmore like she was a stain on the carpet. "Someone get this woman a beginner's handbook," he said into the microphone, and the laughter rolled through the room like a wave. Claire sat in the third row with her notepad on her knee, her pen still moving. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She just kept writing, because she already knew something the captain didn't. She had been in rooms far more dangerous than this one. And if you want to see what happens when the man who laughed stops laughing, stay until the end of this story. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The National Military Medical Leadership Summit came to Ralston, Arizona every 3 years, and every time it did, the Hargrove Convention Center transformed into something caught between a hospital and a headquarters. Banners hung from the vaulted ceilings. Round tables were dressed in navy and white. The registration desk was staffed by volunteers who checked credentials with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the names on those badges mattered. Claire Whitmore had driven 4 hours from Tucson that morning in a car with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat covered in manila folders she hadn't had time to organize. She arrived 40 minutes before the first panel, found a parking spot on the far end of the lot, and sat in the car for a moment longer than she needed to, finishing the last of her gas station coffee. It had gone cold somewhere around the Maricopa County line. She was 38 years old, medium build, brown hair she kept in a practical braid when she was working and wore loose when she wasn't. Today it was braided. She wore her navy blazer over a plain white blouse, her conference lanyard already looped around her neck before she stepped out of the car. The lanyard read, "Claire Whitmore, RN, Civilian Medical Observer." She wasn't a general. She wasn't a decorated officer with a ribbon-covered chest. She was listed on the official program as a panel participant under the Civilian Advisory Track, one of 6 civilian medical professionals invited to contribute alongside active-duty personnel. She had submitted her registration 8 months ago, provided her credentials, passed the background review, and been confirmed. She had a seat at the table. 2 of them, actually, one on the morning panel and one on the afternoon roundtable. She gathered her folders, locked the car, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was already dense with people when she arrived. Dress uniforms moved through the space alongside business suits and hospital badges. A colonel near the coffee station was arguing cheerfully with a Navy physician about readmission rates. 2 nurses from an Army field medical unit were comparing notes near the registration wall. Claire recognized the energy. It was the particular kind of controlled electricity that exists in rooms where smart, driven people are about to argue about things that genuinely matter. She collected her conference packet and found her table assignment. 3rd row, center, good sightline to the stage. She didn't know yet that Captain Dominic Varro had arrived an hour before her. Yes. Varro was the kind of man who treated every room like a perimeter he needed to secure before anyone else got comfortable. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent 3 decades reminding people that he outranked them. He held a distinguished service record in military emergency medicine, 2 overseas deployments, a commendation for field trauma operations in a classified theater, and a published methodology paper that had been adopted as standard training doctrine in 2 branches of service. He was also, by the accounts of people who had worked under him, a man who did not tolerate being questioned. His aide, a young corpsman named Brett Olson, had spent the morning quietly managing Varro's schedule, his slides, and his mood. Olson was 24, clean-cut, and had learned early in his assignment to Varro's unit that the most valuable skill he could develop was the ability to anticipate which way the wind was blowing. The wind this morning was blowing difficult. "The roundtable format is wrong," Varro said to the conference liaison who had come to introduce herself. "I don't share a panel. I present. Then I take questions from the floor." The liaison, a woman named Sandra Pell, kept her expression professionally neutral. "Captain, the roundtable format was agreed upon by all confirmed participants when they registered. It's designed to facilitate dialogue between military and civilian. I'm aware of what it's designed for." He handed her back the program she'd given him. "Make the adjustment." Sandra did not make the adjustment, but she also did not argue further, which meant she absorbed the conflict internally and passed it along to no one, which was a quiet failure that would compound later. Claire found her seat and spent the first 20 minutes of the pre-panel networking period reviewing her notes. She had come prepared to discuss emergency triage sequencing, specifically a set of discrepancies she had identified between published military field protocols and the actual outcomes data from 3 major trauma centers that served returning veterans. It was careful work, built from 18 months of cross-referencing discharge records, surgical reports, and anonymized case files she had accessed through her position at Harmon County Regional Medical Center, where she ran the trauma intake unit. She had been running that unit for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 7 years doing something else entirely, in places that didn't appear on her resume under anything more specific than specialized medical operations support. The conference began at 9:15 with brief remarks from the summit director, a retired brigadier general named Wendell Ferris, who had the practiced warmth of a man who had given 1,000 speeches and understood that the opening remarks were the part everyone sat through in order to get to what they actually came for. He welcomed the attendees, noted the significance of the summit's theme, advancing the standard, medical leadership in crisis environments, and reminded everyone that the civilian advisory track was an intentional part of the program, designed to bridge institutional knowledge with frontline civilian practice. It was this last point that Varro visibly did not appreciate. He was seated at the front table reserved for senior military panelists, and Claire noticed the way his expression shifted during Ferris's remarks. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the jaw. The kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Claire was always paying attention. The first panel began at 9:40. The topic was emergency response doctrine in high-casualty environments, and the format was exactly what Sandra Pell had described, a structured roundtable with 6 participants presenting data points before opening to moderated discussion. Varro went third. His presentation was polished, confident, and built around the results of a field exercise his unit had conducted 14 months prior, a simulated mass casualty event that had reportedly produced remarkable triage outcomes. Outcomes he cited to support his argument that centralized command authority in medical emergencies consistently outperformed decentralized or civilian integrated models. The numbers were impressive. The structure of the argument was clean. The problem, Claire realized as she tracked his data points against her own notes, was that 3 of the statistical benchmarks he was citing did not align with the published outcomes literature she had reviewed. The discrepancy wasn't small. It was the kind of discrepancy that could matter enormously if anyone was using these numbers to design actual protocol. When the floor opened for responses, she raised her hand. The moderator, a Navy commander named Patricia Holm, acknowledged her. Ms. Whitmore, Civilian Advisory Track. Thank you. Claire kept her voice level, consultative, not confrontational. Captain Varro, I want to engage with the data you presented on triage sequencing timelines. Specifically, the 14-minute mean response figure for your mass casualty simulation. I'm finding that number difficult to reconcile with the published outcomes from comparable field exercises in the same period. The literature I've reviewed puts the mean closer to 22 minutes, even under optimal conditions. Can you walk us through the methodology difference? It was a clean question, direct but professional, the kind of thing you ask at a medical conference because the details matter and you want to understand them. Varro looked at her the way a person looks at something they've stepped over 100 times and only now realized was in their way. I'm sorry, he said, not sounding sorry. And you are? Claire Whitmore. I'm with Harmon County Regional, trauma intake. He let a beat pass. Right. He looked back at the room. The methodology isn't something I typically break down for audiences unfamiliar with field operations. The simulation parameters were controlled by military-grade standards, not civilian benchmarks. The numbers are accurate. I'm not questioning the accuracy, Claire said, and she kept her voice exactly where it had been. I'm asking about the methodology. That's not the same thing. The room had gone slightly quieter, the way rooms do when people sense tension but haven't yet decided how to react. Varro's chin came up just slightly. With respect, Ms. Whitmore, comparing your hospital intake numbers to military field simulation data is a bit like comparing a swimming pool to the ocean. I'm sure you're very good at what you do. This is a different discipline. There was a ripple of laughter. Not everyone. maybe a third of the room, the people who read the social cue and responded to it without thinking. A few others were very still. Commander Holmes started to redirect, but Varro wasn't finished. "I'd encourage our civilian participants to observe before they challenge," he said to the room, not quite looking at Claire. "There's a reason we have a separate track." Claire wrote something in her notepad. She did not respond. She let the panel move on. During the mid-morning break, she stood at the coffee station and a man appeared next to her who was not getting coffee. He was in his mid-30s, wore the uniform of an Army medical officer, and had the posture of someone trying to look like he wasn't doing exactly what he was doing. "Lieutenant Marcus Webb," he said quietly, looking at the coffee urns. "I'm with Varro's unit." Claire looked at him. "Okay. What you asked in there?" He paused. "You weren't wrong." She waited. "The 14-minute figure." He picked up a cup he wasn't going to fill. It came from a revised report. The original after action put the number at 19. Someone changed it before it went to the summary documentation. Claire studied his profile. He was clearly uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that comes from carrying something too long, not from being caught. "Who changed it?" He put the cup down. "I have to go." "Lieutenant?" He stopped. "Are there other reports?" she asked. He walked away without answering, but the way he walked told her something. He moved like a man who knew exactly where the exits were and had already mentally rehearsed using them. She carried that conversation back to her table and sat with it while the room refilled around her sob. The afternoon panel was where it escalated. The session's topic was command authority during medical crises. Specifically, the question of when and whether centralized command structures were appropriate in high-stress medical environments. It was exactly the kind of session where Claire's data was relevant, and she had prepared accordingly. She presented for 7 minutes. She laid out her discrepancies carefully, not as accusations but as analytical questions. She cited her sources. She showed the gaps between Varro's published numbers and the broader outcomes literature. She kept her language clinical and precise. Varro interrupted her on the 4th minute. "This is a military medical summit," he said, speaking over her mid-sentence. "Not a hospital administration seminar." "Captain, the floor is—" Holmes started. "I've been patient," Varro said. He had moved slightly forward in his chair, projecting his voice toward the room rather than toward Claire. "But I think we need to acknowledge what's happening here. We have a civilian nurse who, to my knowledge, has never operated in a field medical environment, repeatedly questioning data produced by personnel who have. At some point, that stops being dialogue and starts being obstruction." The word nurse landed like he meant it to, not as a description, as a diminishment. "I'm not obstructing anything," Claire said. Her voice remained level. Not cold, not heated, just steady. "I'm presenting documented discrepancies in the data. If the data is sound, it should be able to withstand a question. And I'm telling you the data is sound." He looked at her directly for the first time since the morning panel. "If you had actual field experience, you'd understand why your comparison model doesn't apply." "Then explain it," she said simply. "I'm listening." He looked at her a moment longer than he meant to. Then he turned back to the room. "I don't think this is a productive use of our time." Sandra Pell appeared at Claire's elbow 20 minutes later, during a breakout period. "Ms. Whitmore." Sandra had the practiced composure of someone delivering a message she didn't write. "Captain Varro has requested that you be moved from this afternoon's roundtable to an observer role." Claire looked at her. "On what basis?" "He's expressed concern that your participation is disrupting the dialogue." "Has the summit director approved this request?" Sandra hesitated. "He's deferred to Captain Varro's judgment on the matter, given his seniority." "I see." Claire stood up. "I'll need that in writing, please." Sandra blinked. Yes, I can arrange that." "Thank you." Claire went back to her seat, opened her notepad, and wrote for 3 minutes straight. Then she took out her phone and sent a text to a contact she hadn't reached out to in over a year. The message was 6 words. "Are you still at the Pentagon?" The reply came back in under 2 minutes. "Yes. What do you need?" She looked up at the convention center ceiling, high and neutral and indifferent, and typed her response. "Oh." The conference resumed after the break, with the atmosphere of a room where something had shifted without anyone officially acknowledging it. Several attendees who had laughed during the morning panel were now noticeably quieter. A pair of military nurses from the Fort Steele delegation had sought Claire out during the break to introduce themselves and quietly tell her they'd found her questions valuable. Varro moved through the afternoon session like a man who had already won. He presented a second methodology framework, cited his own unit's outcomes 3 additional times, and at one point referred to the civilian advisory track as a gesture toward inclusivity in a tone that made clear what he thought of gestures. Claire attended the session she was still permitted to attend. She observed. She documented. She filled 4 pages of her notepad with specifics, timestamps, direct quotes, cross-reference citations. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a bad situation was rush. Rushing was how you made mistakes. Patience was how you built something that held. Webb found her again at 4:15, near the conference center's side corridor, where the foot traffic was light. He wasn't pretending to get coffee this time. He just walked up and said, "There were 3 other reports. From the same simulation? From 3 different incidents over the past 22 months. 2 field medical exercises and 1 actual deployment situation." He kept his voice low, his eyes moving. All of them were revised after initial submission. All of them went through Varro's office before they reached the records division. "Do you have copies?" "Not with me." He looked at her. "You're a nurse." "Yes." That's what he told everyone. That you're just a nurse, that you're out of your depth. He paused. "Are you?" Claire met his eyes. She said nothing for a moment, and the silence itself was a kind of answer. Then, "What made you talk to me?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for 8 months, and you were the first person in that room who did." She gave him a card. Her hospital card. The one with her name and unit. He looked at it, turned it over once, and put it in his pocket. "I'll be in touch," he said. She nodded. She watched him walk away and thought about the texture of the situation. What she knew, what she could verify, what she needed. She had been in situations with worse raw material. Much worse. The last session of the afternoon began at 4:30. Claire found her seat. She was listed as an observer now, so she sat in the back row rather than at the main table, which suited her. From the back row, she could see everyone's face. Varro stood at the front, commanding the room the way he always did, certain of his authority, certain of the shape of the world. He was mid-sentence when the emergency alarm went off. Not a fire alarm. The conference center's emergency intercom. A different tone, sharp and immediate, followed by a calm automated instruction to remain in place while staff responded to a medical emergency in the main ballroom's adjacent corridor. People shifted in their seats. A few stood. Then the double doors at the rear of the room swung open, and a conference staffer appeared, pale and urgent, looking directly at no one in particular. "Is there a doctor? We have a man down. He's not responding." The room moved the way rooms full of medical professionals move in those moments. Not chaos, but a fast convergence toward a single point. Claire was already on her feet. She was through the doors before Varro had stood up from his chair. The corridor outside the ballroom was wide, but crowded with folding tables that hadn't been cleared from the morning registration setup. A man in his 60s was on the ground near the far end. Heavy build, dress uniform, face the wrong color, one hand pressed to his chest. A woman beside him was on the phone, presumably with 911, her voice shaking. 2 conference staffers were standing over him, doing nothing useful because they didn't know what to do. Claire dropped beside him and started working. She checked his airway, checked for a pulse. It was there but irregular, too fast and too shallow. She noted the perspiration pattern, the positioning of his distress, the bruising shadow developing along his left chest wall that told her something she didn't want to know. "His name?" she said to the woman on the phone. "Brigadier General Harold Stine." The woman was his aide. Claire could tell by her uniform and her controlled panic. "He came off a flight 3 hours ago. He said he felt fine. Has he been in any physical trauma recently? Fall, impact, anything in the last 2 weeks? Training review last Thursday. He took a..." The aide stopped. "He took a hit during a demonstration. They said it was nothing. A hit to the chest 2 weeks ago, a delayed presentation, and what Claire was now reading as tension pneumothorax building on the left side. This was not a cardiac event. This was a lung. Does anyone have a thoracic needle?" She looked up. Several uniformed medical personnel had crowded into the corridor. 14 gauge, 3.5 inch, anyone? A Navy surgeon pushed through. I have a... Get it ready. She turned back to Stine. General, I need you to stay very still. I know that's hard right now, but I need you to do that for me. I was trying to speak. His face was wrong. The compression was building, and she was running out of time. Varro appeared at the edge of the crowd. Make room, he said in his command voice. I'm a senior medical officer. He has tension pneumo on the left, Claire said without looking up. Building fast. We need decompression, not triage sequencing. I'll take it from here. Captain. She did look up then, just for a second. Watch my hands or help me. We don't have time for anything else. Something in the tone of it, not the words, but the quality of the voice, the absolute absence of hesitation, made him stop. The Navy surgeon had the needle. Claire took it, located the landmark, and performed the decompression with the efficiency of someone who had done it before, in conditions far worse than a carpeted corridor with good lighting and a crowd of witnesses. Stine's breathing shifted immediately. Not fixed, not perfect, but better. The color change began within seconds. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. By then, Claire had the general stable enough to transfer, had relayed the full clinical picture to the incoming team in under 30 seconds, and had stepped back to give them room. She stood up. Her hands were steady. The corridor was very quiet. She became aware slowly that everyone was looking at her, not just the crowd in the hallway, the people who had come out of the ballroom to see what was happening, the conference staffers. Several of the panelists who had been at the table when she was downgraded to observer an hour ago. Varro was standing 8 feet away. He wasn't looking at his own hands. He was looking at hers. Commander Holmes stepped forward. Ms. Whitmore. She paused. What unit did you say you were with? Claire looked at her. Then she looked at Varro. She didn't answer the question. She went back to the ballroom, sat down at her original seat at the main table, and picked up her notepad. She went back to the ballroom, sat down at her original seat at the main table, and picked up her notepad. Nobody told her to move. That was the first thing that changed. 20 minutes ago, Sandra Pell had delivered the message about her observer status with the apologetic efficiency of someone reading a verdict. Now Sandra was standing near the ballroom entrance, watching Claire with the expression of a person who had just realized they might have made a consequential mistake, and saying nothing at all. The second thing that changed was the room itself. The energy in the ballroom after the corridor emergency was the particular energy of people who had witnessed something they hadn't expected and were still processing what it meant. Conversations were happening in tight clusters, low and fast. Eyes moved toward Claire and then moved away when she looked up. It was the social behavior of a room recalibrating. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a compass needle settles after being knocked sideways. Varro had not come back to the main table. He was standing near the side wall with his aide, Brett Olson, who was talking and gesturing at something on his tablet screen. Varro wasn't looking at the tablet. He was looking at Claire with the particular expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on is not quite where he thought it was. Commander Patricia Holmes sat down across from Claire. I want to finish my earlier question, Holmes said. What unit were you with before Harmon County Regional? Claire set her pen down. That's not on my conference registration. No. Holmes paused. It's not. Claire looked at her, at the careful way she was holding this conversation, not pushing, just opening a door and waiting to see what came through. Holmes was good at this. She'd probably been good at it for a long time. I worked medical support attached to special operations units for 7 years, Claire said. Overseas deployments, 2 of which were in active conflict zones. I came back, finished my nursing credentials through an accelerated program, and went into civilian trauma care. She picked her pen back up. That's the short version. Holmes was quiet for a moment. The decompression you performed in the corridor. Standard procedure. It was a needle thoracostomy without imaging confirmation in an improvised environment with 12 people watching. He was crashing, Claire said. You work with what you have. Holmes nodded slowly. Then she said something Claire hadn't expected. I owe you an apology. When Varro requested your observer reassignment, I should have pushed back harder. I didn't. That was a failure of my moderating responsibility. Claire looked at her. I appreciate that. I'd like you reinstated to full participant status for tomorrow's sessions. I'd like that in writing too, if you don't mind. Claire said it without heat, just as a practical matter. Holmes' mouth curved slightly. I'll have Sandra send it tonight. After Holmes left, Claire sat alone for a few minutes, writing. The paramedics had taken General Stine to Ralston Memorial. She'd overheard the destination from the corridor team. She made a note to check on his outcome in the morning. She wasn't sure she'd be able to get information directly, but she had a few contacts in hospital administration networks who might be able to confirm that he'd arrived stable. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, but the text format was familiar, terse and precise in the way that people trained in certain environments learned to write messages. 6 reports. Not 3. I miscounted earlier. Meet me in the parking structure, level 2, north side, 20 minutes. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she got up and told herself she was probably being dramatic about the fact that her heart rate had ticked upward, because this was a parking garage, not a combat zone, and she had been out of that life for 11 years and she needed to stop reacting like she was still in it. She went anyway. Webb was standing near a concrete pillar when she arrived, still in uniform, his cover tucked under one arm. He'd been waiting long enough to have rehearsed what he was going to say. She could tell by the slight over-precision of his opening. I need you to understand I'm not doing this to damage anyone's career, he said. Okay, she said. I'm doing this because 2 people in my unit were put on administrative action for raising the same questions you raised today. One of them was a medical sergeant with 14 years of service. He filed a formal complaint about the report revisions and was reassigned to a desk position in Tallahassee within 6 weeks. And the other one? Webb's jaw moved. She requested a transfer. She got it, but the transfer came with a performance notation that will follow her for the rest of her service. Claire let that settle. How long have you had this? The documentation, pieces of it, for about 8 months. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it, who to give it to. If I go through the chain of command, it goes through Varro's chain of command, and that's... He stopped. A problem, she said. A significant problem, yes. Are the reports accessible, digitally? The revised versions are on the public record system. The originals? He hesitated. 2 of the originals are in my possession. Secure copies. I printed them before the server records were updated. She looked at him steadily. That took some foresight. I was scared, he said simply. People who are scared make copies of things. She understood that. She understood it more than she could explain in a parking garage conversation. I made a contact this afternoon, someone in D.C. If the documentation supports what you're describing, direct revision of after-action medical reports by a senior officer, this doesn't stay at the summit level. Webb nodded, but something in his expression shifted. There's something else. She waited. General Stine. He glanced toward the stairwell, then back. He wasn't at the summit by coincidence. He's the chair of the Military Medical Oversight Board. He requested a briefing from Varro's unit 2 months ago, specifically about the simulation data. The same simulation data you questioned today. The pieces moved in Claire's mind, rearranging themselves with the particular quiet momentum of things that are finding their correct position. Varro knew he was coming. He's known for 6 weeks. She thought about the way Varro had dominated the summit program, the way he'd positioned himself as the central authority on every panel, the way he'd moved to have her removed the moment she started pulling at the threads of his numbers. She thought about General Stine on the floor of a convention corridor, his left lung filling with air that had nowhere to go. Was there anything unusual about Stine's arrival today? She asked. Her voice was carefully neutral. Webb's expression went flat and careful in a way that told her he'd already asked himself this question. He came off a direct flight. He went straight from the airport to the conference. His aide said he mentioned feeling off during the drive, but attributed it to the flight. A chest impact 2 weeks ago, she said. That's what the aide said in the corridor. I heard her. A chest impact is not a natural presentation for that kind of delayed tension pneumo. It's consistent with it, but it's not common. It requires a specific mechanism of injury. She wasn't saying what she was thinking. Not out loud. Not yet. There wasn't enough to say it, but she was thinking it. Webb seemed to follow her silence to its logical end because his breathing changed slightly. Claire. It was the first time he'd used her name. I know, she said. You can't just... I know. She looked at him directly. I'm not saying anything I can't support. I'm saying we need to be careful, and we need to move quickly, and you need to get those 2 documents somewhere outside of your personal possession tonight. He stared at her. Where? She thought for 2 seconds. Do you have a personal email account? Not military server. Yes. Send copies to yourself and then forward them to the contact I'm going to give you. His name is Derek Foss. He's a civilian investigator attached to the Pentagon IG's office. I'll text you his secure contact. She paused. And Marcus. He looked up the use of his first name. Don't tell anyone you talk to me. Not tonight. She drove back to her hotel through Ralston's grid of flat, wide streets, the kind of city that spread itself out confidently under an enormous sky. And she sat in her car in the hotel parking lot for 7 minutes before going inside. Not because she was afraid. She had been afraid before, real fear, the kind with a physical weight to it. And this wasn't that. This was something else, the tight alertness of a situation that had exceeded its initial parameters and needed to be recalibrated. She called Derek Foss from her room. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for her to call since her text that afternoon. Tell me, he said. She told him. She was precise and sequenced and left out nothing relevant. Foss was quiet through most of it, the particular quiet of someone who was listening hard and would have questions at the end. When she finished, he was silent for 4 seconds. 6 revised reports. That's what Webb told me. He has physical copies of 2 originals. And Stine. He's at Ralston Memorial. I don't have his current status. I can get that. Another pause. Claire, what you're describing, if the revision pattern holds across all 6 reports, this is a systematic falsification of military medical records. That's not a disciplinary matter. That's a federal investigation. I know. Varro has connections that go above the summit level, above the oversight board, potentially. If this surfaces wrong, if it looks like a personal grievance or a civilian trying to undermine military authority, it won't look like that, she said, because it isn't that. The optics have to be clean. Then help me make them clean. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the city's lights coming through the gap in the curtains. I need 48 hours and a secure channel for Webb's documentation. Can you do that? Foss took a breath. I can get you 60 hours and a secure upload portal by tomorrow morning. But Claire, you need to stay visible. Don't disappear from the conference. Don't act like you know more than you do. Don't give Varro any reason to think the ground is moving under him. Understood. And if anything happens that feels wrong, I'll call you, she said. Not in 40 minutes. Immediately. She said she would, and hung up and sat in the quiet of the room for a moment, listening to the air conditioning unit rattle faintly against the window. The next morning, she arrived at the conference center at 8:15. She was wearing the same blazer as yesterday. She had slept 5 hours, which was more than she'd gotten in some situations, and less than she'd gotten in others, and she felt approximately functional. She collected a cup of coffee that was marginally better than yesterday's and found her seat at the main table, where her name card had been moved back to participant status sometime between midnight and this morning. Sandra Pell caught her eye from across the room and gave her a look that contained an entire apology compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. Claire gave her a small nod and turned back to her notes. Varro arrived at 8:40. He walked in the way he always walked, with the stride of a man who controlled the perimeter, and he went straight to his seat without looking at her. But she was paying attention, and she noticed the slight delay before he sat, a half second where his body registered her presence at the main table and processed what that meant. The morning session was on medical resource allocation in mass casualty scenarios. It was, in theory, unrelated to yesterday's tensions. In practice, it was the same conversation wearing different clothes, and everyone in the room knew it. When Claire spoke, she was measured. She contributed to the discussion at the appropriate points, raised questions that were substantive but not provocative, and gave Varro no opening to challenge her credentials or her presence. She was professional to the point of being almost boring, which was exactly the right register. Varro presented his second major paper of the summit. It was tight, well-structured, and cited the same simulation outcomes he'd referenced yesterday, with minor elaborations. Claire wrote down 6 specific data points as he delivered them. She already knew 4 of them were inconsistent with the original documents Webb had described. But she let him finish. She let him take his applause. She wrote her 6 points and circled them in pen and waited. At 10:40, her phone buzzed under the table. She glanced at the screen. Webb had sent the documents to Foss's secure portal at 6 a.m. All 6 reports. He'd found a way to access 4 more originals overnight, which told her something about what he'd been willing to risk. At 11:15, she received a second message. This one from a number she didn't recognize, and the content was a single line that made the coffee go cold in her stomach. Webb reported to Varro's office at 0900 this morning. "I don't know what he said." She looked up from the table. Across the room, Brett Olson was watching her. Not Varro. Olson. He held eye contact for exactly 1 beat too long, then looked away at his tablet. Claire set her phone face down on the table. She kept her breathing even. She thought about the sequence of events. Webb had sent the documents at 6. Varro's office knew about it by 9. That was either a 3-hour delay in the discovery, or Webb had told someone himself, or there was a third possibility she didn't want to think about. She needed to know which one. During the morning break, she found a quiet corner near the fire exit at the conference center's east side and called Webb's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She tried again from the lobby. Voicemail. She was back at the table for the 11:30 session when she finally saw him, Webb, walking through the ballroom's rear entrance with the specific walking pace of someone who has been told something they didn't want to hear and is still absorbing it. He didn't look at her directly. He sat at the far end of the military personnel section and opened a folder he didn't appear to be reading. She needed to talk to him. Not here, not now, not with Olson's eyes moving between them like a metronome. The 11:30 session was an exercise in patience. She sat through a 40-minute presentation on logistics support for forward medical units that was genuinely interesting under any other circumstances, and she answered 2 questions from the moderator with the calm coherence of a person who was absolutely not tracking Webb's body language from across a large room. He left during the Q&A period. She waited 4 minutes, then excused herself to use the restroom. She found him in the east corridor, standing near a water fountain that he was not using. "What happened this morning?" she said quietly. Webb's face had the look of someone who had just had a very unpleasant conversation and was still deciding how much of it to share. "Varro called me in at 9. About the reports? About you." He kept his voice very low. "Someone told him you'd been asking questions outside the sessions. He wanted to know if I'd spoken to you." "What did you say?" "I said I'd introduce myself at the coffee station yesterday morning, which is true." A pause. "I didn't say anything else." She studied him. "Did he know about the documents?" "He didn't mention them directly, but he—" Webb exhaled. "He mentioned the secure portal, not by name. He said there were people at the summit trying to access restricted records through unauthorized channels, and that anyone who had provided information to outside contacts would be subject to a formal conduct review. The chill that moved through her was not panic, it was information. He has someone monitoring the upload activity. That's what I think. Which means he knows the documents went somewhere. He may not know where yet." Webb's hands were not entirely steady. "Claire, if he knows I pulled those originals—" "The documents are already with Foss," she said. "They're out of your hands. They're out of mine. That part is done." "That's not—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "That's not all of it." She waited. "When I went into Varro's office this morning," he looked at the floor, then back at her. "There was a man I didn't recognize, civilian. No badge, no lanyard, no summit identification. Varro introduced him as a colleague, but he didn't give a name or an affiliation, and the way he was standing in that room— How was he standing? Like he owned it," Webb said. "Like he was there to make a decision, not attend a meeting." Claire looked at the corridor wall. The fire exit sign at the end of it, the flat neutral light coming through the high windows. "Stay at the conference," she said. "Don't avoid Varro, don't seek him out, act normal." "Act normal," he repeated, like the concept was slightly foreign. "I know." She pulled out her card again, then remembered she'd already given him one. "Do you still have my number?" "Yes." "If anything changes, anything, you call me. Not a text, a call." She was halfway back to the ballroom when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway. "Miss Whitmore." A voice she didn't know. Male, measured, with the particular vocal pattern of someone who chose words carefully because they understood words were precise instruments. "This is Richard Calloway. I'm the Summit Director's Deputy for Security Operations. I've been asked to request your presence in Director Ferris's office at your earliest convenience." "Of course," she said. "I can come now." "That would be appreciated." She was 3 steps from the office door when she checked her phone one more time and found a message from Foss. Not a text. A flag notification from the secure portal system, the kind that only generated when someone attempted to access an uploaded document from an unauthorized source. Someone had tried to pull Varro's original reports from the portal in the last 22 minutes. They hadn't gotten through, but they had tried. Claire put her phone in her pocket and knocked on the director's door, and whatever was waiting for her on the other side of it, she walked in with her hands steady and her breathing even, and her face showing nothing at all. Director Ferris's office was on the 2nd floor of the conference center's administrative wing, separated from the summit noise by 2 sets of heavy doors and a carpeted corridor that muffled everything to a low hum. The room itself was standard executive: a wide desk, a conference table with 6 chairs, a wall of framed photographs showing Ferris at various points in his career. The American flag in the corner. The air conditioning running slightly too cold. Ferris was behind his desk. Richard Calloway stood near the window, mid-50s, silver tie, the particular stillness of someone who was paid to observe rather than participate. And seated at the conference table, positioned at an angle that was neither confrontational nor welcoming, was the unnamed civilian Webb had described. He was maybe 60, compact in the way of someone who had stayed physically deliberate about it past the age when most people stopped trying. He wore a dark suit with no pocket square, no tie pin, nothing that would allow anyone to clock him as anything in particular. Ferris stood when she entered. "Ms. Whitmore, thank you for coming quickly. Please, sit." She sat at the conference table, which put her across from the unnamed man. Calloway stayed at the window. Ferris came around the desk and took the chair at the head of the table, which placed him between her and the other man in a way that was either deliberate or accidental. She assumed deliberate. "I'll be direct," Ferris said. "We've had a complex 24 hours. "Yes," she said. "Your intervention with General Stine yesterday was remarkable. I want to say that clearly before anything else. His surgical team at Ralston Memorial confirmed this morning that the decompression you performed in the corridor was the decisive factor in his survival." He paused. "The general is out of surgery. He's stable." She let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she was holding. "That's good to hear. He's asked to speak with you when he's able." Ferris folded his hands on the table. "However, there are other matters requiring my attention, and some of them involve you in a way I need to address directly." The unnamed man had not moved or spoken. He was watching her with the patience of someone who had decided he would learn more from watching than from talking. "There have been allegations," Ferris continued, "that certain documentation has been removed from restricted records and transferred to outside parties without authorization. This is a serious matter under Summit security protocol and frankly under broader federal guidelines regarding military medical records." Claire looked at him steadily. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking you to help me understand what's happened." "With respect, Director, those are different things, but they don't always feel different." She kept her tone even. "If someone has made a specific accusation, I'd like to know who made it and what it contains." Calloway shifted slightly at the window. Ferris looked at his hands. "Captain Varro has submitted a formal concern to my office. He alleges that you have been coordinating with Summit personnel to access and transmit classified after-action documentation from his unit." "Classified," she repeated. "That's the characterization he's used." "Has anyone verified the classification status of those documents?" A pause. "That's under review." "Because," she said, "my understanding is that after-action medical reports of the type Captain Varro has been presenting at this summit are not classified. They're internal military records, which is a different designation, and internal records that contain evidence of systematic falsification are subject to oversight board review under standard DoD protocol." She paused. "I'm happy to be corrected on the legal specifics if I'm wrong." The unnamed man spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, precise, and utterly without effect. "You're not wrong." Ferris looked at him. Calloway looked at him. Claire kept her eyes on him and waited. "The documents in question are not classified," the man said. "They're designated internal restricted, which is a lower threshold. Their transmission to the Pentagon Inspector General's office, which is where they currently are, is not only legal but consistent with mandatory reporting obligations when the documents contain evidence of record falsification by a commissioned officer. The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Ferris said slowly. "And you are Vincent Mara." He said it the way people say their name when they don't expect it to require explanation. "I'm here at General Stine's request. I arrived yesterday afternoon, which was before the General's medical event." He looked at Claire. "The General had concerns about the data being presented at this summit. He asked me to observe." She understood then why Webb had read his presence in Varro's office as belonging. He hadn't been there because Varro had invited him. He'd been there because Mara had inserted himself into Varro's morning to see what Varro would do when someone was watching. "Then you know about the reports," she said. "I know what's in the portal," Mara said. Lieutenant Webb's submission was thorough. Ferris looked between them with the expression of a man who had thought he was running a meeting and was discovering he was not. "Vincent, if there's an active IG referral, there will be a full referral by end of business today. The preliminary review has already begun." Mara stood, straightening his jacket. "Ms. Whitmore, I'd like to speak with you separately, if Director Ferris doesn't object." Ferris opened his mouth, then closed it, which was its own kind of answer. They walked the east corridor, the one near the fire exit where she'd spoken to Webb an hour ago. Mara moved like someone who had walked a great many corridors in a great many buildings and had learned to read them. "How long have you known Derek Foss?" he asked. 11 years. We worked adjacent operations in the same theater, different organizations." "He said the same about you." Mara stopped near the high windows. "He also said you were the most operationally precise person he'd worked with in those environments, and that if you told him something was wrong with a set of numbers, he'd bet the building on it." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she didn't. "I need to ask you something, and I need a direct answer," Mara said. "When you performed the decompression on General Stine yesterday, what did you observe about the injury pattern?" She had been waiting for this. Not because she'd expected Mara specifically, but because she'd known someone would eventually ask it. The question she hadn't voiced in the parking garage. The thing she hadn't said to Webb because there wasn't enough to say it. "The presentation was consistent with traumatic pneumothorax from blunt chest trauma," she said carefully. "Delayed tension development, which is not unusual in that mechanism of injury. The aide confirmed a chest impact 2 weeks prior during a training demonstration." "And?" She looked at him. "And the bruising pattern on his left chest wall was inconsistent with a 2-week-old impact injury. The coloration was wrong. Too recent." Mara didn't react outwardly, but something in his stillness shifted. "How recent?" "I couldn't give you a precise window in a corridor without imaging, but the discoloration pattern I observed was more consistent with 48 to 72 hours than with 2 weeks. She kept her voice neutral and clinical because that was the only register appropriate for what she was describing. "I don't know what that means. I'm reporting an observation." "It means," Mara said quietly, "that someone may have ensured General Stine arrived at this summit in a condition that would prevent him from conducting his oversight review." She had thought it. Hearing it in someone else's voice made it real in a different way. "Varro knew Stine was coming," she said. 6 weeks ago, yes. And knew what Stine was planning to review. "The simulation data, yes." Mara looked at the corridor floor. "We don't have evidence of direct causation. We may never have it. But the pattern of behavior, the report revisions, the retaliation against personnel who raised concerns, the attempt to remove you from the summit program, it forms a picture." "What do you need from me?" "A formal statement. Everything you observed, from the moment you arrived at this conference to this conversation. Signed, dated, submitted through the IG channel by tonight." "I can do that. And one more thing." He looked at her directly. "When the investigation becomes public, and it will become public, likely within the next 24 to 48 hours, Captain Varro is going to claim that you orchestrated this, that you came to this summit with the intention of destroying his career because of a personal grievance. He's going to paint you as a disgruntled civilian with an agenda." "I know. He's good at that. He's done it before." "I know that too." She looked at the fire exit sign. "I don't have a personal grievance. I have 6 months of comparative outcomes data, 11 pages of notes from 2 days of this summit, and a general who is alive because someone was paying attention. She looked back at Mara. Let him say what he's going to say. Mara studied her for a moment. Then he gave a single nod that contained more respect than most people communicated in full sentences. Tonight, then. She returned to the afternoon sessions because Foss had told her to stay visible, and Mara had effectively confirmed the same directive. She sat at the main table. She participated in the round table on resource allocation doctrine. She asked 2 questions that were good questions, and let 2 other panelists take the credit for the follow-up insights, which was a skill she had developed over years of working in environments where drawing attention to yourself had concrete costs. Varro presented in the afternoon session as if nothing had changed. He was good at it. The composure of a man who believed he had already solved the problem and was simply waiting for the confirmation. He referenced his simulation data again. He cited his unit's outcomes twice. He spoke with the assured authority of someone standing on ground that had not yet registered the crack running through it. But Claire was watching his aide now, not Varro himself. Olson sat through the session with his tablet on the table in front of him, and every 20 minutes or so he checked the screen and then looked at Varro and then looked away. The rhythm of it was off. Too frequent, too deliberate. I was monitoring something, waiting for something. After the session, Olson disappeared for 30 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a sealed manila envelope that he passed to Varro with the specific casualness of someone trying very hard to look like they were doing something routine. She didn't know what was in the envelope. She filed it. Webb was in the late afternoon session but wouldn't look at her directly. His posture had the compressed quality of someone managing fear in a professional setting, which she understood. She caught his eye once and gave him nothing, just held it for half a second and looked away. A reminder. She was still there. The ground was still the same. She drafted her formal statement in her hotel room starting at 6:15 p.m. and worked for 90 minutes straight, pulling from her notes with the methodical focus of someone who had written field reports under worse conditions. She was precise about timestamps. She was careful to separate what she had observed from what she had inferred. She included the conversation with Webb, the encounter with Mara, the access attempt on the secure portal, and her clinical observations about General Stine's injury presentation, with appropriate qualifiers on the last item. She submitted it through Foss's secure channel at 7:47 p.m. Foss called at 8. "It's good," he said. "Clean. They'll use it." "What's the timeline?" "The preliminary findings go to the Assistant Secretary's office tomorrow morning. If they concur, and based on what Webb submitted, they'll concur. A formal investigation is opened and Varro is notified." A pause. "At that point, he's going to know it came from the summit. He's going to know it came through you." "I know. Do you have security at the hotel?" She looked around the room, the standard locks, the chain she'd put on the door out of habit when she arrived. "I'll be fine." "Claire." "I'll be fine, Derek. I've slept in worse places with less." A pause. "That's true, but not comforting." "Get some sleep," she said. "Call me when you hear from the AS's office." She was asleep by 10. She was awake by 5:15 when her phone lit up with a message from a number she recognized as Mara's. "Stine out of ICU. Alert and speaking. He's asked for a full briefing." She was already sitting up. She sent back a single word. "When?" His reply came in under a minute. "This morning, 7 a.m., Ralston Memorial. Can you be there?" She was typing yes when a second message came through, this one from Webb, time-stamped 4 minutes earlier. She read it once, then twice, with the still attention of someone making sure they understood exactly what they were reading. "Varro pulled my service record tonight, all of it. He went through his adjutant's office, flagged it as a disciplinary pre-review. I think he's building a case to have me charged. And Claire, the man in Varro's office yesterday. Mara. I looked him up through a contact of mine." She waited for the second part of the message to load. "He's not Pentagon IG, he's something else. I can't find a clean record for him anywhere. My contact said his name comes up in relation to a joint task force that was dissolved 4 years ago under circumstances nobody will talk about. Whatever he is, he's not what he said he was." Claire set the phone down on the bed and looked at the ceiling. Outside, Ralston's sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. An ordinary desert morning, birds she couldn't name starting up somewhere in the parking lot landscaping, the distant sound of an early highway. She picked the phone back up and opened her contacts, scrolling past Foss, past Webb, past Mara's number, to a contact she hadn't used in 4 years. A contact with no name, just 2 initials and a callback instruction. She stared at it for a long moment, then she dialed. It rang once. A voice answered. Not groggy, not surprised. Just present, the way people are present when they have spent years training themselves to be reachable. "I was wondering when you'd call," the voice said. She recognized it immediately and felt the past 11 years compress into something very small and very far away. "I need to know who Vincent Mara actually works for," she said. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough to mean something, not long enough to mean panic. "Where are you right now?" the voice said. "Ralston, Arizona." "Don't go to that hospital meeting," the voice said. "Not until I call you back." "How long?" 20 minutes. Stay in your room." The line went dead. Claire sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone in her hand and the sky going from dark to gray outside her window, and she understood that she was no longer at a medical conference where a powerful man had tried to dismiss her. She was somewhere else entirely, and the dimensions of it were still becoming clear. The 20 minutes Mara's contact had promised turned into 18, and Claire spent them standing at the window rather than sitting on the bed, watching the parking lot fill with the thin early light of an Arizona morning. A hotel maintenance worker was dragging a trash bin across the asphalt below. A minivan was pulling out of a spot near the exit. Ordinary things. The kind of things that exist in the background of every moment, whether the moment is ordinary or not. Her phone rang at 5:37. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Lena Duval, and hearing it was like opening a door Claire had sealed shut with the deliberate patience of someone who understood that some doors needed to stay closed. Duval had been her commanding officer's intelligence liaison in the second deployment, the one that didn't appear on Claire's official service record, under anything more specific than a date range and a geographic designation. Duval was meticulous, cautious, and had a mind that organized information the way other people organized furniture, with an instinctive sense of what went where and why. "Vincent Mara," Duval said without preamble. "He's real. The name is real, the identity is clean going back 26 years. But the institutional affiliation he gave you is partial, at best." "Partial how?" "He does have a relationship with the IG's office, consulting basis, but his primary operational role is through a joint oversight body that was reconstituted 3 years ago after the task force dissolution Webb found. It's called the Medical Systems Integrity Group, MSIG. It operates under a joint DoD and Department of Justice mandate, which means it has investigative authority that overlaps both military and federal jurisdiction. Claire processed this. Which means he's not just observing Varro. He's building a federal case, Duval confirmed. Varro is the immediate target, but from what I can access, and I want to be clear that I'm working from second-hand intelligence here, the report falsification pattern may be connected to a procurement fraud loop that goes considerably higher than a single captain's methodology paper. How high? A pause. I don't know. That's not me being cagey. I genuinely don't have the top of that chain. Another pause. But Claire, Mara didn't tell you what he actually was because he couldn't tell you. If you had known you were feeding information into a federal fraud investigation, any statement you provided could have been challenged as obtained under false institutional pretense. He needed you to act as an independent observer, which is exactly what you did. She absorbed that. The slight wrongness of it, being used, even for legitimate ends, settled somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Not rage. Just the particular friction of realizing that the board was larger than the space you'd been playing in. "Is he trustworthy?" she asked. "Within the scope of his mandate, yes. He's not Varro. He's not building a personal empire. He's doing a job." "Okay." "The hospital meeting this morning," Duval said. "I'd go." "You just told me not to." "I told you not to go until I called back. I've called back." A beat. Stine is the chair of the oversight board. He's also, apparently, one of the people who authorized the MSIG investigation in the first place. If he's asking to see you from a hospital bed 12 hours after chest surgery, there's a reason. Mara will be there. Yes. And now you know what you know, which changes the geometry of that conversation in your favor. Duval was quiet for a moment. "Be careful, Claire. Not because Mara is dangerous to you, Because situations with this many moving parts have a way of producing collateral damage for people who are standing in the wrong place when things resolve. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Another pause, and then something softer came into the voice, the register that existed underneath the professional precision. It's good to hear you, even like this. Yeah, Claire said, it is. She hung up and got dressed and was in her car by 6:15, heading toward Ralston Memorial, through streets that were still quiet enough that she could think clearly. The hospital was a medium-sized regional center, clean and functional, with the particular morning hush of a place that never fully stops but has found its lowest gear. She parked, checked in at the front desk with her name and the purpose of her visit, and was escorted by a floor nurse to the ICU step-down unit on the 4th floor where General Stine had been moved overnight. Mara was in the corridor outside the room, standing with a cup of coffee and the unhurried posture of someone who had been there long enough to feel settled. He looked at her when she came off the elevator, and something in his expression acknowledged that the conversation they were about to have was going to be different from the ones they'd had before. She walked up to him and said simply, "MSIG." He didn't flinch. "Who told you? Does it matter?" He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his coffee. "It matters in terms of whether there's an operational security issue I need to manage." "There isn't. The person I spoke to has higher clearance than either of us and no interest in undermining your case." He accepted this with the minimal nod of someone filing it away. "Which it was, at 11:42 last night." He looked at her. "You being an independent civilian observer was legally necessary for the first 48 hours of evidence collection. That window closed when the AS's office received the preliminary findings this morning. So now I'm not an independent civilian observer. Now you're a material witness and a consulting expert, if you're willing, with full disclosure of the investigation's scope and mandate." He paused. "I'm sorry I couldn't be more direct earlier. The legal architecture required it." She looked at him. She was still carrying the friction of it, the small, settled wrongness. But Duval had said he was doing a job, and she understood doing a job. She had done jobs that required her to hold back information from people she was working alongside, and she had not enjoyed it, and she had done it anyway because the structure demanded it. "Tell me what's actually happening," she said. They went into a small family waiting room down the hall, unoccupied at 6:40 a.m., 2 couches and a table with a dying plant on it. Mara sat down. She sat across from him. The investigation, he explained, had begun 14 months ago when an auditor in the Military Medical Procurement Division noticed a pattern of contract awards that correlated with specific after-action reports. Units whose field data showed exceptional outcomes in mass casualty scenarios were being preferentially recommended for equipment and supply contracts with a set of private medical logistics vendors. The contracts were worth, in aggregate, over $200 million across 3 fiscal years. The connection between falsified outcomes data and contract preference had taken 8 months to establish with sufficient evidentiary confidence to bring to the MSIG mandate. Varro's unit was the most visible node in the pattern, but it was connected to 3 other unit commanders and at least 2 civilian contractors who appeared to be coordinating the data. General Stine had been brought in as the oversight board chair specifically because he had no prior relationship with any of the implicated parties. His review of the summit data was intended to be the final step in corroborating the pattern before formal charges were filed. He came to this summit carrying documentation that would have effectively closed the preliminary phase, Morris said. "The chest impact 2 weeks ago." "You believe it was deliberate," she said. "I believe it's being investigated as potentially deliberate. That's a distinction I need to maintain carefully." Who else knew he was coming? Within Varro's circle, Varro himself, his adjutant, possibly Olson. He paused. "And at least one person in the procurement division whose name I'm not in a position to share." "How far does it go?" Mara set his coffee down. "Further than Varro, he's the operational piece. But the network above him, the coordination of the falsifications, the contract steering, that involves people who are still protected by institutional relationships that the investigation is actively working to dismantle." She sat with this for a moment. "What do you need from me for the next 24 hours? General Stine wants to hear from you directly about your clinical assessment of his presentation on arrival. That becomes part of the formal medical record for the parallel track of the investigation, the potential deliberate harm inquiry." He looked at her. "And I need you back at the summit for the morning session." Because Varro still doesn't know the AS's office received the findings. He'll know by 9 this morning. The notification goes through official channels. A pause. I want someone in that room who can observe his response and report it accurately. You want a witness? I want you, he said. There's a difference. General Stine was propped at 30 degrees in a hospital bed, with monitoring leads visible above his gown collar and the specific pallor of someone who had come through serious surgery in the last 20 hours. He was large, even horizontal, a broad-framed man in his mid-60s with close-cut gray hair and eyes that were alert in the particular way that suggested he had forced himself to alertness, because the alternative was unacceptable to him. His aide, the same woman from the corridor, whose name Claire now knew was Captain Renata Suarez, was in the corner with a tablet, doing the quiet organizational work of someone managing a senior officer's life from a hospital room. Ms. Whitmore, Stine said. His voice was rougher than it would normally be, the residual effect of intubation, but the authority in it was intact. Sit down. She sat. They tell me you put a needle in my chest in a hotel corridor. Yes, sir. Without imaging. There wasn't time for imaging. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who had spent decades assessing people quickly. Renata said you asked about the injury pattern while I was still on the floor. I asked about recent physical trauma. Yes. What did you see that made you ask? She told him. The same thing she'd told Mara. The bruising pattern, the coloration inconsistency, the timeline that didn't fit the 2-week-old impact narrative. She was clinical about it. She didn't editorialize or speculate beyond her direct observation. When she finished, Stine was quiet for a moment. The training demonstration 2 weeks ago was real, he said. I did take a hit. A colleague ran a force resistance drill and misjudged the contact. It happened. He paused. But I was cleared by a physician the following day. No pneumothorax, no rib fracture, no significant bruising. She held very still. What you observed, he said, is not consistent with an injury from 2 weeks ago. No, she said. It's not. Suarez in the corner had stopped typing. The night before I flew to Ralston, Stine said slowly, I attended a formal dinner. DoD event. Varro was in attendance. He looked at the ceiling. I had a drink I didn't pour myself. I felt unwell by the end of the evening, which I attributed to fatigue and travel preparation. I was fine the next morning, or I thought I was. I got on the plane. The silence in the room had a weight to it. I want that documented, he said. The dinner, the drink, the timeline. I want it in the formal record. Yes, sir. And I want to be very clear about something. He looked at her directly, and there was nothing weak in the look, despite the leads and the pallor and the hospital gown. What you did in that corridor was not incidental. If you hadn't been in that building with that particular training and paying that particular quality of attention, I would not be in this bed. I'd be somewhere considerably less recoverable. He paused. I was told you were removed from your participant role at the summit because Captain Varro found your questions inconvenient. That's accurate. And you stayed. Yes. Why? She thought about it for a second, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give him the accurate one rather than the polished one. Because the questions were worth asking, she said. And because I've been in situations where nobody asked them, and I've seen what that costs. He held her gaze for a long moment. You're going back to the summit this morning? Yes. Good. He closed his eyes briefly. Not sleep, just the deliberate rest of a man managing his resources. Don't let them make you small again, Ms. Whitmore. She stood. They didn't manage it the first time, sir. The closest thing to a smile that a man 12 hours post-surgery could produce crossed his face, and she left him to rest. She was back at the Hargrove Convention Center by 8:50. The morning session was scheduled to begin at 9, and the conference center lobby had the surface energy of a normal professional gathering. Coffee lines, badge checking, the ambient sound of 100 people moving through a space with purpose. Underneath it, something had changed. She felt it before she could identify it. The specific atmospheric shift of a room where information had begun to move through unofficial channels. Clusters of people who were talking slightly too quietly. Pairs of attendees whose body language had the careful alignment of people sharing something they hadn't decided yet how to handle publicly. She found her seat at the main table and set her notes in front of her. Varro came in at 8:57. He was in full uniform, back straight, moving with the same controlled authority he'd carried through 2 days of this summit. But she had been watching him long enough to read the places where the control was working harder than it should have been. The set of his jaw was slightly too deliberate. His eyes moved across the room once, quickly, in a pattern that was assessment rather than greeting. He saw her at the main table. She looked back at him with the calm, neutral attention of someone who had nothing to hide and knew it. He sat down at the far end of the table and opened his materials. The session began. The morning topic was field medical training standards, and it was handled by 2 panelists who were not Varro, which gave the room a different quality than the previous sessions. More relaxed, more genuinely conversational. Claire participated twice, both times briefly and substantively, contributing to the actual discussion rather than advancing any agenda. At 9:47, Brett Olson appeared at the ballroom's rear entrance. He was moving differently than he'd moved all week, faster, with the slightly off-balance quality of someone carrying news they hadn't had time to fully process. He moved along the wall to Varro's end of the table and bent down to say something very quietly near Varro's ear. Claire watched Varro's hands. They were flat on the table when Olson started speaking. By the time Olson finished, the right one had curled slightly at the edge. Not a fist, just a tension, small and involuntary, the kind the body produces when the mind receives something it was prepared for but still finds difficult to absorb. The notification had arrived. Varro excused himself from the table at 9:52, following Olson out of the ballroom with the measured pace of a man who would not allow himself to be seen rushing. The moderator acknowledged his departure with a brief nod and continued the session. Claire made a note of the time, then closed her notepad and listened to the rest of the panel. The formal notification of investigation, Mara had explained, required Varro to report to the summit director's office and surrender his credentials pending the preliminary review. It was a procedural step, not an arrest, not a public action, but it would remove him from the conference program for the remainder of the summit, and it would do so in a way that required an explanation to conference organizers that would not remain private for long. By the afternoon break, the unofficial information channels had done their work. She could see it in the way people were moving around the conference center, with the slightly heightened awareness of people who know that something significant is happening and are waiting for someone to make it official. Webb found her near the coffee station at 3:15. He looked exhausted in the way of someone who hadn't slept and had been managing anxiety at high intensity for 12 hours. But something else was in his face too, something that looked like the very early, uncertain beginning of relief. "Foss called me this morning," he said. "He told me the documents are in the formal record." "They are." "And the service record pull? The disciplinary pre-review Varro initiated on me?" "Mara's office is aware of it. It'll be flagged as potential witness intimidation in the investigation file." Webb exhaled. It was a long, unsteady breath that he'd clearly been holding for a while. "I keep thinking, if you hadn't been here, if you hadn't asked those questions in the first panel." "Someone would have," she said. "Eventually." He looked at her. "But it was you." She picked up her coffee. "Go get some sleep tonight, Marcus." "Yeah." He looked at the coffee station, then back at her. "Thank you." She nodded and let him go. The official announcement came at 4 p.m. Director Ferris assembled the summit's senior attendees in the main ballroom and made a brief, carefully worded statement. Captain Varro had withdrawn from the summit's remaining program due to an administrative matter requiring his attention, and the schedule would be adjusted accordingly. He thanked Varro for his previous contributions and moved immediately to the logistical details of the afternoon's revised agenda. It was the most neutral phrasing possible for what had happened, and it satisfied no one in the room, which meant that every version of the real story was already circulating freely through the informal networks that conferences run on. Claire sat through the announcement and the revised session that followed. She presented twice more in the day's remaining programming, once on triage sequencing, once on interinstitutional data sharing and emergency response. And both times the room listened with the quality of attention that had not been present when she'd first tried to raise these points 48 hours ago. It wasn't because she'd become a different person. It was because the room had been shown that she was something other than what they'd been told to see. She didn't feel triumphant about it, She felt tired mostly, in the way you feel tired after carrying something for a long time and setting it down. Not the absence of weight, exactly, but the memory of it still registered in the body. At 5:30, she received a message from Mara. Varro's adjutant has submitted a cooperation statement. 2 additional names in the procurement chain. The investigation is accelerating. She read it, noted it, and went to change for the evening. The summit held its closing dinner that evening in the ballroom, reconfigured from conference layout to banquet tables with the efficiency of a venue that had done this hundreds of times. Claire had not planned to attend, but Holm had found her in the corridor at 5 and asked her directly, with the particular quality of asking that made clear it mattered. She went. She sat at a table with Commander Holm, 2 military physicians from the Fort Steele delegation, and a civilian hospital administrator from Sacramento named Paul Drent, who turned out to have spent 3 years doing international medical relief work and was genuinely interesting to talk to. She ate something, she couldn't have said later exactly what, and talked about emergency response interoperability and the specific logistical problems of coordinating civilian and military medical resources in overlapping crisis zones, and it was a real conversation, the kind she'd come to this summit for. It was also, underneath everything, the most normal 2 hours she'd had in 72 hours, and she was aware of needing it even as she was having it. At the table's natural end-of-dinner pause, Holm looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something to you without it sounding like a speech." "Then don't make it a speech," Claire said. "Fair." Holm set her coffee down. "What you did in that corridor, and I mean both things, the medical intervention and everything that came before it, it took a particular kind of discipline. Staying quiet when someone is publicly humiliating you requires more control than most people understand. Most people either fight back or shut down. You kept working." "I learned from people who had to work harder than I did in worse conditions," Claire said. "It's not especially impressive when you put it in context." "Maybe not in your context." Holm paused. "In the context of this particular conference, it was what was needed." Claire looked at the table. There was something she almost said. Something about how none of it would have mattered if Webb hadn't been scared enough to make copies, or if Foss hadn't been reachable, or if the needle had been a millimeter off in a carpeted corridor with 12 people watching. The architecture of any outcome included so many pieces that the idea of crediting one person for it always felt slightly wrong to her. But she understood what Holm was trying to say, so she said, "Thank you," and meant it, and let the moment be what it was. She was in the parking lot at 9:15, keys in hand, when her phone rang. "Foss." "They picked up Olson an hour ago," he said. She stopped walking. "On what charge?" "Conspiracy to obstruct." They connected him to the portal access attempt from yesterday morning. And Claire, a pause that had weight in it. The phone records from Varro's office going back 4 months. Olson was the conduit. Varro communicated with the procurement chain through Olson's personal devices, which means Olson knew everything. "He was 24 years old," she said. "Yes." She thought about Olson watching her from across the room with the metronome precision of someone assigned to do it. 24. And deep enough in this that he'd been carrying it the way people carry things they climbed into before they understood the depth. "The procurement chain names," she said, from Varro's adjutant's cooperation statement. 2 names. One is a retired colonel currently serving as a vendor liaison for a medical logistics company called Cartwright Medical Group. The other is a civilian contracting officer in the DoD Acquisitions Division. Foss paused. The Cartwright connection is significant. They hold 4 of the 7 contracts that were steered. We're looking at approximately $68 million in potentially fraudulent awards through that relationship alone. Claire stood in the parking lot with the desert air going cool around her. $68 million. A number that turned this from the ambition of one captain protecting his reputation into something that had been running for years, fed by the falsified records of soldiers and medical personnel whose actual outcomes had been quietly rewritten so that certain numbers could justify certain contracts. "What about Varro?" she said. "What's his status now?" "Formally suspended from duty pending the investigation. He's been instructed to remain in Ralston until investigators debrief him. He's retained counsel." A pause. "His lawyer made a statement 2 hours ago, claiming the investigation is the result of a coordinated campaign by a civilian participant at the summit to undermine military medical leadership." She had expected this. Mara had told her it was coming. Let him say it. The statement names you specifically. I know it does. It's going to circulate. Media will pick it up. Derek. She found her car and leaned against it. How many after-action reports were falsified? Current count is 9 across 4 unit commands. And what did those falsified reports do to the actual resource allocation for units whose real outcomes were less impressive? A long pause. 3 units in the comparison group received significantly reduced equipment funding in fiscal years where the falsified data was used as a benchmark. One of those units, he stopped, started again. One of those units reported 2 preventable field deaths in a training exercise where inadequate medical equipment has been cited as a contributing factor. She closed her eyes. The parking lot was very quiet. 2 people, dead in a training exercise. An equipment failure that could be traced through a chain of deliberately falsified data and steered contracts back to a system that had been choosing money over outcomes for 3 years. That information needs to be part of the public record, she said, when this investigation surfaces. It will be. The MSIG team is building the full impact documentation now. She opened her eyes. The Ralston sky above the parking lot was enormous and clear and full of stars. She had grown up in a part of the country where city light drowned most of them out, and she had spent years in places where the sky looked exactly like this, too big and too indifferent to organize itself around the specific difficulties of what was happening on the ground beneath it. Get some sleep, she said. You first, Foss said, and hung up. She was almost to the hotel entrance when her phone buzzed one more time. Not a call. A message from Suarez, General Stine's aide. The general is asking about your availability tomorrow morning. He'd like to meet before you leave Ralston. He has something he wants to give you. She typed back that she was available at 8 and pocketed the phone and pushed through the hotel door into the cool lobby. The conference ended tomorrow. She would drive back to Tucson, back to the trauma unit at Harmon County Regional, back to the intake protocols, and the overnight shifts and the particular texture of the work she had chosen when she came back from the life she'd lived before this one. The world she'd returned to, that she'd built carefully and deliberately from the materials of a different kind of knowledge. She rode the elevator to her floor and walked the corridor to her room and put her keycard in the door. Inside, her folders were still spread across the bed from Tuesday morning, when she'd gathered them from her passenger seat in the conference parking lot and dumped them there before leaving for the summit. 18 months of comparative outcomes data, cross-referenced discharge records and surgical reports and anonymized case files. The work she'd brought to ask a simple question: do the numbers match the reality? They hadn't. And the reason they hadn't had turned out to be larger and uglier and more damaging than she'd understood when she drove out of Tucson with cold gas station coffee and a cracked dashboard. She started gathering the folders, stacking them neatly, when something slid out from between 2 of them and landed on the bedspread. A folded piece of paper she didn't immediately recognize. She picked it up, unfolded it. It was a printout. An email thread, the kind you screenshot and print when you want a hard copy of something, and you're not entirely sure what you're going to do with it. The thread was between 2 addresses she didn't recognize, and it was dated 6 months ago, and as she read it, she understood what she was looking at. It was a conversation about her, specifically a conversation about whether to invite her to this summit in which one of the correspondents, using an address she didn't recognize, had argued against her inclusion and provided, as a rationale, a detailed summary of her operational history that was considerably more complete than anything on her public record. Details that should not have been accessible to anyone outside a classified personnel file. The other correspondent had responded, "She'll be useful. Bring her." She read the thread twice. She turned the paper over. On the back, in a handwriting she also didn't recognize, were 4 words. "Ask Mara who sent this." She stood in her hotel room with the paper in her hand and understood that the situation had just produced one more layer that she hadn't known was there. Someone had known she was coming to this summit before she did. Someone had arranged her invitation with knowledge of her classified operational history. Someone had wanted her in that room, and they had not told her why. And Mara, who had presented himself as an observer operating at General Stine's request, was apparently connected to whoever that someone was. She set the paper on the nightstand. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She was tired in a way that went past the last 3 days and reached further back, to the accumulated weight of years of working in situations where the full picture was always something you assembled after the fact, from pieces that were distributed across people and places and conversations that never quite added up to a clean line. She picked up her phone and composed a message to Mara. Short and direct, the way she'd learned to communicate in environments where words were expensive. "We need to talk tomorrow. Before I see Stine. Don't make me ask twice." She sent it and set the phone down and lay back on the bed without moving the remaining folders. His reply came 4 minutes later. "I know. I've been waiting for you to find it." She slept 4 hours, which was enough. At 6:15 she was dressed, and at the small desk by the window with her notes open and the printed email thread smoothed flat beside them, rereading it with the clear eyes that come from sleeping rather than from solving anything. The handwriting on the back was precise and small, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned to write in environments where space and time were both limited. She didn't recognize it. She had spent part of last night trying to remember if she'd seen it before and concluded she hadn't. Someone had placed that paper in her conference folder. She had checked those folders in her car before driving to the summit on Tuesday morning, organizing them in the parking lot with her cold coffee going colder beside her. The paper had not been there then, which meant it had been placed in her folder sometime between Tuesday morning and last night, inside the conference center, in a bag she had left at her seat during sessions, in a room full of military medical professionals who had been told she was an observer and treated her accordingly. She was not dealing with an amateur. At 6:55, she texted Mara, lobby, 7 a.m. He was there when she came off the elevator, same dark suit, same coffee, standing near the windows that looked out on the parking lot as the desert morning assembled itself in shades of copper and pale yellow. He turned when he heard her and did not pretend that the conversation they were about to have was going to be comfortable. She put the printed email thread on the low table between them and sat down. He looked at it. He picked it up. He read it, though she suspected he didn't need to, that he knew its contents already and was using the reading as a way to organize what he was going to say. The silence between them had the particular texture of a silence in which two people are deciding how honest they're going to be and how fast. "You know what this is," she said. "Yes." "Then tell me what I don't know." He set the paper down and sat across from her. He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for a reckoning and had made his peace with it. 18 months ago, he said, the MSIG investigation identified a gap in its evidence architecture. We had the procurement pattern. We had the contract data. What we needed was someone who could walk into the summit environment, legitimately, with genuine credentials, with no institutional tie to the investigation, and independently arrive at the same conclusions we'd already reached. Someone who would ask the right questions in the right room without being coached to ask them. She felt the cold clarity of it settling over her. You needed a witness who didn't know they were witnessing. We needed someone whose expertise was real, whose questions would be genuine, and who would not be positioned as an investigative plant. Because if this case goes to federal prosecution, and it will, any evidence obtained through a coordinated plant would be challengeable. The independence of the observation had to be authentic. He paused. Your outcomes data was already in the public domain. The discrepancies you documented between published military protocol and civilian trauma outcomes were legitimate and substantial. You had standing to be at that summit. Everything you did there, you did on your own initiative. You arranged my invitation. We ensured the invitation was extended. You met every qualification independently. The invitation committee made their own decision, with access to my classified operational history, which was reviewed through proper legal channels within the investigation's scope. He looked at her directly. You were never in danger. You were never set up to fail. Every protection available to a material witness was in place around you from the moment you arrived. She looked at him. She was not angry, not exactly. Anger was too simple for what she felt, which was the complicated internal weather of someone who has been used well, used for something that mattered, used in a way that required their ignorance to function, and who understands all three of those things simultaneously and has to sit with the friction between them. The person who left that note, she said. Webb. She blinked. Webb knew. Webb knew the investigation existed. He didn't know the details of your involvement until he saw how Varro treated you in the first session and made his own judgment about what that meant. Mara paused. His decision to approach you was his own. It was not part of the plan. It was the plan working better than planned. She thought about Webb near the coffee urns, not getting coffee. The careful angle of his body. The weight of what he'd been carrying for 8 months, looking for someone to hand it to and not finding the right person until a woman in a navy blazer raised her hand during a panel discussion and refused to lower it when the room told her to. He risked his entire career, she said. Yes, he did that independently. A pause. He's going to be protected. The investigation will document the retaliatory service record pull as witness intimidation. His cooperation is already part of the formal record. Mara looked at the table. He's a good officer who was in a bad situation and waited for someone to give him a reason to act. I didn't give him a reason, she said. I just asked questions. That was the reason. She looked at the email thread on the table. She'll be useful. Bring her. The flatness of it. The calculation. She thought about whether she would have come to this summit if she'd known. If someone had called her and said, "We need you to walk into a room and ask real questions and not know why it matters beyond what you can see." She thought she probably would have, but there was something in the not knowing that she was still processing, a residue she didn't quite have the right word for. Being accurate was not the same as being honest. She had been used accurately. That was different from being used with her full knowledge and consent, and the distinction mattered to her in a way she wasn't going to minimize just because the outcome had been worth it. The 2 people who died, she said, in the training exercise, with the inadequate equipment. Mara's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Yes, that's what this was actually about, not the conference, not even Varro. She looked at him. That's what you needed someone to stand up in that room and say. He was quiet for a moment. There are families who haven't been given a complete account of what contributed to those deaths. When the investigation concludes publicly, they will be. She sat with that. The weight of it was different from the weight of being used or the weight of the scheme or even the weight of 3 days of sustained pressure in a room full of people who had decided what she was before she opened her mouth. It was the weight of why. The actual, concrete, human why that sat underneath all the rest of it. The reason the numbers had to be right. The reason the questions had to be asked. The reason silence in the face of institutional pressure was not a neutral act but a choice with consequences that landed on the youngest and most vulnerable people in the system. Okay, she said. Mara looked at her carefully. Okay? I'm not going to pretend I'm entirely comfortable with how this was structured. She folded the email thread and put it in her jacket pocket. But I understand why it was. And the outcome matters more than my comfort. She stood up. Don't do it again. He looked up at her. I won't have reason to. That's not what I said. A pause. Something moved across his face that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition of a boundary being drawn by someone who knew exactly where they stood and had enough experience with institutional machinery to understand the difference between a request and a warning. Understood, he said. She left him with his coffee and went to see General Stine. The 4th floor of Ralston Memorial was quieter than it had been yesterday morning, the step-down unit running at the measured pace of a place where the acute crisis has passed and the longer work of recovery has begun. Stine was sitting up higher in the bed, a deliberate improvement, Claire suspected, not just a medical one. He was the kind of man who would push the angle as far as his surgical team allowed because horizontal felt like surrender, and surrender was a posture his body had never learned to hold. Suarez was there again, organized and quietly efficient in the corner. Mara, who had apparently moved faster than Claire through the hospital corridors, was standing near the window. And there was a 4th person she hadn't expected, Commander Holm, in civilian clothes, sitting near the door with the slightly self-conscious posture of someone who wasn't sure if they belonged and had come anyway because belonging was not the point. Stine looked at Claire when she walked in. Sit down. She sat. I spoke with the Assistant Secretary's office at 6 this morning, he said. His voice was stronger than yesterday. Not recovered, but recovering, which was its own kind of statement. The formal investigation is fully opened as of 7 a.m. Captain Varro has been suspended from duty with pay pending final findings. His adjutant and 2 members of the procurement chain are cooperating. The Cartwright Medical Group contracts are frozen pending audit. She nodded. Brett Olson was taken into federal custody last night. He's retained counsel and has indicated he intends to cooperate fully. Stine paused. He's 24 years old. The prosecutors will take his age and the degree of coercion he was operating under into account. She thought about Olson watching her across the ballroom with his metronome attention, 24 and already in too deep to see the surface from where he was standing. She didn't feel much satisfaction about his arrest. She felt something more like the tired acknowledgement that systems which corrupt people usually start with the youngest and most impressionable, because they're the easiest to pull in before they understand what they're being pulled into, and after they've already done enough to feel like stopping isn't an option. The public announcement is scheduled for 10 a.m., Stine continued. DoD Public Affairs joint statement with the IG's office. Your name will be in it. I know. Varro's legal team will make counterstatements. They already have. His jaw moved slightly. You should prepare for some noise. I've been in noisy situations before. Not like this kind. This is the media version, which has its own specific unpleasantness. He looked at her steadily. I'll be making a personal statement as well, about what you did in that corridor and what you did in that ballroom before anyone came to your assistance. He paused. I want you to know that that statement comes from me, not from the investigation. It's not strategic. It's accurate. She held his gaze. Thank you, General. Don't thank me. It's the least the situation requires. He shifted slightly in the bed, managing it carefully. The awareness of the incision, the monitoring leads, the body that had been through significant trauma and was cooperating within limits it was not accustomed to. Now, I'm told you need to start driving back to Tucson before noon. My unit is short-staffed today. I said I'd be in for the afternoon shift. Holm made a small sound near the door that was somewhere between admiration and disbelief. Then I'll be brief. Stine reached toward his bedside table and picked up a small sealed envelope that Suarez had apparently placed there in preparation. He held it out. This is a formal letter of commendation for your personnel file, co-signed by my office and Commander Holmes. It documents your intervention, your professional conduct, and the quality of your contributions to the summit program. He paused. It also contains a personal note from me that is not for your file. She took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. And there's something else. He looked at Suarez, who opened a folder and produced a single-page document. The Military Medical Advisory Council has a civilian liaison seat that comes up for appointment every 2 years. The current seat is vacant. The appointment requires nomination from a board member and confirmation from the Assistant Secretary's office. He met her eyes. I'm nominating you this morning. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something real has been said. She looked at the document, then at Stine. I'm a trauma intake nurse at a regional hospital. You're a former Special Operations medical specialist with 7 years of field experience, 18 months of documented comparative outcomes research, and a demonstrated ability to walk into a room full of senior military medical personnel and hold the line on a factual question when every social pressure in that room was pushing you to sit down and stop talking. He tilted his head slightly. The liaison seat exists specifically to bring that kind of perspective into the advisory structure. You'd keep your position at Harmon County. The commitment is 4 meetings per year and availability for consultation on specific cases. He paused. You don't have to decide now. I know. She held the nomination document in her hands and felt the specific texture of a moment that was asking something of her. Not demanding, not orchestrating, just genuinely asking. The difference was important. She had been in enough situations where the difference between those two things was everything. I'll read it. That's all I'm asking. She stood. She looked at Mara near the window, at Holm near the door, at Suarez with her folder, at General Stine pushing himself toward upright, because that was the kind of person he was, and always had been, and probably always would be. Get better fast, she told him. He almost smiled again. I plan to. She was on the highway by 11:15, the desert spreading itself out in every direction with the flat, confident generosity of landscape that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone passing through it. The folders were on the passenger seat, organized now. The envelope and the nomination document were in her bag. The cracked dashboard caught the morning light at the same angle it always had, and probably always would, until the day the car finally gave out. She drove for 40 minutes before she called anyone. She called Webb. He answered on the second ring. Hey. Hey. She passed a truck hauling something covered in blue tarps. How are you doing? Honest answer? Please. A long exhale. I slept until 9. I haven't done that in about 8 months. A pause. I feel like something I was holding put itself down. Which sounds… No, she said. It doesn't sound like anything. It sounds right. The investigation team debriefed me this morning. 2 hours. They were thorough. Another pause. They told me the service record pull has been flagged, that it won't stand. Good. Claire. He stopped, started again. I know Mara told you how it was set up, the whole thing. He did. I left that note. I want you to know why. His voice had the careful quality of someone who had practiced this but hadn't made it entirely clean yet. When I saw what Varro did to you in that first session, the way he talked about you, the way he dismissed you, I knew what that was. I'd seen it happen to people in my unit, people who were right and got buried for being right, because being right and being powerful are not the same thing, and the institution consistently confused them. A pause. I didn't want that to happen again. I needed you to know that whatever was happening around you was bigger than one conference and one captain being a bully. I needed you to be able to protect yourself. She drove. The highway was long and straight and certain. You risked a lot on someone you'd known for 8 hours. I'd watched you for 8 hours, he said. That's different. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately by someone who has no obligation to look carefully, to be read correctly by a person in a room full of people who had read you wrong. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. A pause that carried genuine weight. For asking the question. They talked through the logistics, the next steps in the investigation process, his unit situation, the transfer that was coming. He was considering a medical training development position at Fort Caldwell, designing curriculum for field medical certification. It felt right, he said. She told him it sounded right. He told her the existing simulation benchmarks needed serious work. And she told him she believed him completely, and he laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and brief, the kind that comes out when you've stopped bracing for impact. After she hung up, she drove in silence and let the landscape do what landscape does when you give it room to do it. The DoD public announcement dropped at 10 a.m. She heard the radio version when she stopped for gas outside of Coolidge, a national news segment summarizing accurately in the broad strokes. A senior military medical officer suspended pending federal investigation, falsified after-action reports, fraudulent procurement scheme, $112 million across 3 fiscal years. A civilian medical professional instrumental in surfacing the evidence. They didn't use her name on the radio, but by the time she got back on the highway, it was on every major outlet she could see on her phone screen when she stopped at a light. She read General Stine's personal statement at a red light outside of Maricopa. The individual most responsible for creating the conditions in which this evidence could surface is a civilian trauma nurse who was publicly dismissed, deliberately marginalized, and formally removed from her participant role during this summit by the officer now under investigation. She remained. She continued to work. And when a medical emergency arose that required exactly the skills she had been told she didn't possess, she acted without hesitation and saved a life. The military medical community owes her a debt that a letter of commendation does not come close to covering. She put her phone down and drove. Varro's legal team released their counter-statement at 11:30. She read it later, closer to Tucson, and it was exactly what Mara had told her it would be. A carefully constructed narrative of a decorated officer targeted by a civilian with a personal grudge, a predetermined conclusion in search of supporting evidence, a campaign against military authority dressed as professional concern. It named her specifically. It questioned her credentials. It characterized her intervention with General Stine as reckless and unauthorized. It was well written in the way that expensive lawyers write things well, and it would circulate, and some people would believe it, because some people always believe the version delivered by the man in the uniform with the service record and the ribbons. Regardless of what the evidence, patiently assembled over 3 days in a conference ballroom, actually showed. She finished reading it and put her phone in the cup holder and drove the last 40 minutes to Tucson with both hands on the wheel and the windows down, the hot, dry air moving through the car like the desert, reminding her she was almost home. She was home by 1:15. She showered, changed into scrubs, stood in her kitchen eating crackers and cheese over the sink because she hadn't had a real meal since the conference dinner, and her body had registered this complaint firmly. Then she drove to Harmon County Regional and walked through the staff entrance at 2:30. The charge nurse was Glenn Petrus, 19 years in the role, constitutionally unflappable. He looked up when she walked in, read her face the way he'd learned to read it over 6 years of working alongside her, and said, "You okay?" "I'm fine." She picked up the intake board. "What do we have?" Bay 3 has a construction fall, possible C-spine precaution, CT pending. Bay 5 is chest pain, rule out MI, cardiology on the way. Bay 7 is a diabetic complication, 68-year-old. She's been managing her own condition for 30 years and she knows it. "I've got it." "Claire." He said it in the way that made her stop. Not urgently, just firmly enough to require a response. She turned. "Your name's on the news," he said. Not pressing, not making it into anything, just registering that he knew, and she knew, and it didn't need to become a conversation right now. "I know," she said. "Bay 3. He nodded and let her go. The construction worker in Bay 3 was 31, conscious, frightened, and in pain, with the specific quality of pain that comes when you don't know yet whether your life has just permanently changed. She worked his case with the attending, managed the precautions, talked to him while they waited for imaging in the voice she used with patients who were scared. Not falsely reassuring, not clinically distant, just present and honest and direct. The CT showed no spinal injury. He cried a little when she told him, which was the right response, and she let him have it without rushing him past it. She moved through the afternoon with the particular grounding of work that is real and immediate and does not permit abstraction. The chest pain in Bay 5 was esophageal spasm, dramatic and frightening and not the catastrophe the patient had feared. The diabetic complication in Bay 7 involved a woman who knew more about her own physiology than 2 of the residents currently on rotation, and Claire treated her accordingly, which the woman noticed and acknowledged with the brief, tired gratitude of someone accustomed to being talked over and mildly astonished when they aren't. By 6 p.m., the unit had turned over twice. Her feet hurt in the specific way they hurt after 6 hours of hard floor. She had eaten half a granola bar from her locker at 4:30 and nothing else. Somewhere in the city, her name was on the news, attached to the story of a man who had pointed at her like she was a problem and discovered, too late, that he had misidentified what kind of problem she was. Here, in Bay 3 and Bay 5 and Bay 7, none of that was the thing that mattered. What mattered was the 31-year-old who had gotten to keep his spine. What mattered was the 68-year-old who had been treated like she knew what she was talking about, because she did. What mattered was the next person through the door, whoever they were, and the quality of attention they would receive from a woman who had learned, across 7 years in conflict zones and 6 years in a regional trauma unit, and 3 days in a conference ballroom in Ralston, Arizona, that attention was the most fundamental thing one person could offer another. Varro's formal charges were filed on a Thursday, 8 days after the summit ended. Conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, falsification of official military records, obstruction of a federal investigation, abuse of command authority. The charges carried penalties his legal team's counter-narrative had not been designed to survive. She received the news from Foss in a brief phone call between patients and said, "Okay, thank you," and went back to work. Raymond Voss, the retired colonel with the Cartwright Medical Group connection, took a plea arrangement in the investigation's second week. His cooperation confirmed the architecture of the scheme at its highest functional level. 3 unit commands, 2 contracting officers, and Cartwright's director of government relations, coordinating over 4 years to steer $119 million in federal contracts toward a network built on numbers that bore only a managed relationship to reality. The 2 deaths from the training exercise entered the public record with their names. Wesley Drummond, 23, Ariel Kasparian, 27. Killed in a training scenario where inadequate equipment had been cited as a contributing factor in a unit that had been underfunded because falsified benchmarks from Varro's operation had skewed the allocation criteria. The news cycle gave them 48 hours before moving on. She gave them considerably longer, privately, in the way that people keep certain names as a personal accounting. Not grief exactly, because she hadn't known them, but something adjacent to obligation. A recognition that the reason the numbers had to match the reality was that when they didn't, specific people paid the specific price of it with their lives. Brett Olson received a deferred prosecution agreement in exchange for full cooperation, supervised probation, community service, permanent bar from federal employment. 24 years old, recruited into the network in his first month before he'd understood what he was being recruited into, and after he'd already participated enough that the cost of stopping had felt prohibitive. She was not glad about this outcome, and she was not troubled by it. She thought it was probably the right call, with the qualified rightness of decisions that have to balance multiple competing considerations and arrive somewhere livable. Marcus Webb received a formal commendation. His service record was cleared. The retaliatory administrative action was expunged. He was offered reassignment to a unit of his choice, and when he called to tell her about it, his voice carried the uncertain brightness of someone who has been given back something they'd stopped being sure they'd ever recover. "Fort Caldwell," he said. "The training position. I'm taking it." "Good. The simulation benchmarks they're currently using are," he paused. "Let me just say there's significant room for improvement." "Fix them," she said. "I plan to." A pause. "The curriculum thing. I've been thinking about how the questions get built in from the beginning, how you train people to notice when the numbers don't match the outcomes, before they're ever in a room where someone is telling them to sit down." She understood what he was describing. The thing that made Webb different from the people who had stayed quiet wasn't courage exactly, or not only that. It was that he had already been asking the question internally for 8 months before she walked into the room and asked it out loud. The question itself, does this match reality, was something that could be taught, or at least cultivated, in environments that valued it. It was worth trying. "Let me know when the curriculum is drafted," she said. "I have some comparative data that might be useful." The Military Medical Advisory Council liaison appointment came through formally 6 weeks after the summit. She accepted it on a Tuesday afternoon in the Harmon County Regional Break Room, reading the confirmation letter twice before folding it and putting it in her bag. Glenn Petrus happened to be at the coffee machine when she looked up. He read her expression. "Good news?" "Something new," she said. "Same thing?" She considered it honestly. "Sometimes." The first advisory council meeting was in Washington 3 months later. She flew in on a Tuesday morning, commercial flight, middle seat, which she regarded as neither a hardship nor an indignity, but simply a logistical fact, and took a cab to the building and signed in at the security desk and was given a badge and escorted to a conference room where 14 people were already seated around a table. She was the only one in scrubs. She had come directly from a Tuesday morning shift and changed in the airport bathroom with the efficiency of someone who had changed in far less convenient circumstances. But the scrubs were clean, and she looked functional, and she was not going to apologize for either of those things. The council chair was a retired surgeon general named Marcus Okafor, 71 years old, precise and warm in the specific combination that characterizes people who have spent decades understanding that rigor and humanity are not competing values. He shook her hand when she came in and said, "Ms. Whitmore, we've been looking forward to this." "So have I," she said, and meant it without qualification. She sat down. She put her notes on the table. The meeting began, and she was in it, fully, practically, with the same quality of attention she brought to Bay 3 and Bay 7 and every intake report she'd written in 6 years. And it felt, in the way that the right room at the right time feels, like an extension of the same work rather than a departure from it. She had done things in darker conditions with higher immediate stakes, in places that didn't appear on her record under anything more specific than a date range and a designation. She had come back from all of it and built something quieter and more specific, a life rooted in the daily work of keeping people alive in a regional trauma unit, which was not a lesser form of service than the classified version, just a different geography of the same fundamental commitment. This was something else again. This was the room where the protocols were written and the benchmarks were set and the numbers were supposed to be arrived at honestly. She was here to be one of the people who made sure they were. Not the loudest voice, not the most decorated, just the person who had read the primary documents before she walked in and who would ask every single time whether the numbers matched the reality. Varro's court-martial convened 11 months after the summit. It lasted 9 days. She testified on the 4th day, by secure video connection from a conference room at Harmon County Regional, that Glenn Petrus had quietly cleared and arranged without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did and never mentioned. She testified for 2.5 hours. She began with Tuesday morning in the Hargrove Convention Center parking lot and moved through everything she had observed, documented, contributed to, and understood. She was precise about timestamps. She separated observation from inference. She did not editorialize and she did not perform. Not outrage, not vindication, not the satisfying narrative closure that the situation might have permitted. She just told what happened, in the order it happened, with the accuracy that the facts required. Varro's attorney attempted twice to reframe her testimony as the product of personal animus. The military judge sustained both prosecution objections before she had to respond to either. She answered every question she was asked. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She held the camera, which meant she held the screen where Varro was seated, with the steady attention of someone who has nothing to hide and has made a considered decision to let that fact be visible. He looked at her once during the 2.5 hours. Just once, for maybe 3 seconds. She held it and let him look and gave him nothing except the same expression she'd had since she walked into that ballroom with her pen moving and her notebook open, the calm, unhurried attention of someone doing their job. When the connection closed and the room went back to being a conference room, Glenn appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that were, for once, actually the right temperature. She sat for a moment and let the weight of 11 months come to rest somewhere it could stay. "You good?" he said. "Yeah." She took the coffee. "Yeah." The verdict came 6 days later. Guilty on all substantive counts. 22 months in a federal correctional facility. Forfeiture of all pay and allowances. Reduction in grade. Dishonorable discharge. Raymond Voss received 4 years. The Cartwright Director of Government Relations received 6. The cooperating contracting officers received suspended sentences and permanent debarment. It was not a clean resolution, because clean resolutions exist in stories and not in federal investigations. There were pieces the investigation hadn't fully reached, connections severed before they could be traced, documents more thoroughly destroyed than Webb's copies could reconstruct. The network had been damaged, not eliminated. The conditions that had generated it, unchecked authority, institutional silence, the slow normalization of numbers that told people what they wanted to hear rather than what was true, those conditions were not eliminated by a court-martial. They were structural. They required ongoing attention from people who were willing to pay it. She knew that. She had always known it. The work was not the kind that ends. In the break room, on a Thursday in November, more than a year after she had driven 4 hours to Ralston with cold coffee and a cracked dashboard and a car full of folders she hadn't organized, she received a text from General Stine, who had returned to full duty 5 months after his surgery and was running the oversight board with the particular intensity of a man who has been reminded, at close range, why the work matters. The 2 units underfunded due to falsified benchmarks have received full supplemental equipment grants. Both unit commanders were briefed today on the investigation's findings and the corrective action. "I thought you should know." She read it twice. She set her phone down. She picked up her coffee. Outside the break room window, Tucson was doing what it did in November. Bright and clear, and the mountains catching the afternoon light at an angle that made them look both permanent and temporary, which was probably accurate. Mountains last longer than most things, but not longer than everything. She thought about Wesley Drummond and Ariel Kasparian, 23 and 27. She thought about what it meant that 2 units now had equipment that worked, because someone had finally insisted that the numbers matched the reality. She thought about the specific chain of decisions and moments and questions and silences that connected a falsified simulation report to a family that now had a complete account of why their person didn't come home from a training exercise. She was not the only link in that chain. She had never been. Webb had risked his career. Foss had answered on the second ring. Stine had gotten on a plane despite feeling wrong. Holm had apologized and meant it. Duvall had pulled a name in 20 minutes from a contact she hadn't activated in years. The chain was longer than any one person, and the credit belonged to its length. But she had been in the room, and she had stayed in the room, and she had kept asking the question when every social pressure in the room was telling her that the question itself was the problem. That had mattered. It had mattered in the specific, traceable, documentable way that things matter, when you can follow the chain from one moment to its consequences. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, went back to the unit. There were people waiting because there were always people waiting, and she was always the person who walked in and asked what they needed and got to work. Not because the work made her exceptional or defined her or would be remembered by the people she helped, most of whom would forget her name within a week, which was exactly how it should be. She didn't do the work to be remembered. She did it because the work was there, and she knew how to do it, and because she had learned across more years and more kinds of rooms than she could fully account for, that showing up with your full attention and refusing to put down your pen is not a dramatic act. It is not heroism in the movie sense. It doesn't feel like anything much from the inside. Just the quiet accumulation of choices to remain present when leaving would be easier. But those choices compound. They build on each other across days and years and rooms until they amount to something that can be pointed to, something that changed the shape of the situation for people who would never know who changed it. That was what the work produced. Not triumph, not a clean ending. Just the incremental, imperfect improvement of conditions for people downstream who deserved better than what the numbers had been giving them. She walked back to the unit. The fluorescent lights were the same as they always were. The intake board had 3 new names on it. The afternoon was doing what afternoons do in a trauma unit, which is require everything you have without asking whether you have it. She had it. She had been dismissed in a ballroom, and she had stayed. She had been removed from a seat and returned to it. She had watched a man try to define her by her title, and she had let him speak, and then she had done the work that made the definition irrelevant. She had been used by an investigation she didn't know she was part of, and she had sat with the discomfort of that, and concluded that the outcome outweighed the method, and then she had said don't do it again because both things were true simultaneously, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She was not a symbol of anything. She was a woman who had showed up to a conference with cold coffee and 18 months of research, and the particular quality of attention that comes from years of working in environments where inattention has a cost you can measure. That was all. That was enough. The world does not change because someone is exceptional. It changes because someone who knows something refuses to act like they don't, because they stay in the room when the room wants them out, because they keep the pen moving when the room stops laughing, because they understand that the question does this match. Reality is not a small question. It is, underneath every system that has ever failed anyone, the only question that was ever supposed to be asked. She asked it on the 4th day of the investigation. She had asked it the day before that and the day before that. She would ask it at the next advisory council meeting and the one after that for as long as she held the seat. And she would ask it tomorrow morning, walking into her unit at Harmon County Regional, picking up the intake board, looking at the names of people who needed someone to pay attention. Because that was the work. And the woman they had laughed at in the 3rd row was still here, still working, and she was never going to stop.